The morning my son accused me, the world narrowed to the sound of one sentence. "It was you, he said, as if the two words could seal the shape of truth. His voice was not the tremor of a man in shock. It was the hard, measured thing of someone who had decided what to believe. Behind the phone, traffic hummed. Across the hallway, sunlight made a strip on the kitchen table like a blade. I remember thinking then that sound would follow me for years, the clean click of judgment before anything else arrived. They put handcuffs on me in the doorway where I had once dried his school uniforms and sorted his pocket change. The steel had the same cold certainty as the sentence. A neighbor watched through curtains as strangers in uniforms led me past the lavender bushes I had planted to mark spring. I did not scream. I had learned long ago that certain things were quieter when met with silence. So I walked. Before the officers read me the list of crimes, before the prosecutor's file slid across a desk like a small, lethal thing, I had a lifetime of small, ordinary images stacked behind my eyes. My son, Alfredo, stood in them like a son usually does, scraped knees smudged with green from the soccer field, a faded sweater with one sleeve turned, a gap in his smile he would not notice until school photos. I had taught him to tie his shoelaces, to make a cup of tea, to admit when he had done wrong. The thought of his hand placing blame on my chest like a coin felt like salt. There are moments that rearrange the furniture of a life. That morning rearranged mine down to the floorboards. A week earlier, the house was ordinary in its small betrayals. We had tea on the cracked mug I kept out back. He stopped coming to dinner on Sundays. His calls shortened. The first time I saw her, Clara, he came home smelling faintly of perfume, as if he had walked through another room with his skin still remembering. There were excuses at first: work late, a friend in need. Later, he admitted it in a way that didn't feel like confession, but like an invitation to witness a private betrayal. "She's different," he said, one evening as the kettle hissed. "Busy. She needs me." They call her many things in the neighborhood. Some said the woman he chose. Others whispered the one who took him. To me, she was the shadow that slid between my son and the rest of the house. When I called her a mistress aloud to the neighbor who came by, it was not because I wanted to name the scandal. It was because that was what living beside someone felt like. The sense of being set aside for something secret and consuming. The worst part was not only that he favored her, it was that his favor turned into conviction. The day the phone rang, he did not speak as a son who had been hurt. He spoke as an accuser. Clara had been in the hospital. The pregnancy she had carried did not reach the air. The town's small arteries pulsed with rumor.
In the prosecutor's version, the chain of cause pointed a way that led to my door. "You told them it was infection," Alfredo said into the receiver, a surgeon's steadiness to his tone. "You were there. You did this." I remember the concrete under my shoes then, the courthouse steps where ordinary people learned how quickly the system could believe the right story. Paper does strange work. A medical report, a note, a hastily written line can become scaffolding for guilt. They read the report aloud in a room that smelled of old varnish and nervous people. The microphone captured my voice, but my thoughts belonged to the kitchen where my son had first learned to pour his own cereal. The world narrowed, then closed. They led me into a cell that night. The metal door exhaled on its hinges like something alive. The mattress was thin. The blanket smelled faintly of chemical soap and other people's years. Iron was a language in that place. The scrape of keys, the slam of metal doors, the metallic tang that lived on the air like dust. My name became a number. The first night, I counted the minutes by the footsteps in the corridor until dawn made a pale, merciless line under the door. When morning came, the officer unlocked me, and the world of small betrayals continued, but in a different key. I learned to measure days in small units, the sound of breakfast trays, the echo from the yard, the slur of someone else's grief down the hall. It was a geography of absence. The letters I had once written in careful hand became contraband anchors. At first, I did not write for myself. I wrote to make the world record a different possibility. Pages that said plainly that I had not done what they claimed. I filled a small notebook with the things I remembered, the names of children in the neighborhood, the pattern of rain on the roof the year Alfredo turned 7, the way his hand smelled after he climbed the orange tree. I wrote so that there would be a trail of ordinary proof that might someday make a jury imagine me as more than the sum of a line on a medical chart. A guard found the notebook folded into the lining of a robe where I had hidden it after a morning count. He did not confiscate it. He read a page, and his eyes changed. The hard line between us, prisoner and keeper, momentarily thinned. You write like someone who keeps her hands busy, like someone who knows how to stitch things back together. That small kindness was dangerous because it reminded me I was still someone who knew how to stitch things. I started reading the entries aloud to 2 women on the bunk across from mine. Maria, who had been held for debt, folded her hands and listened like a child listening to a story. The other woman, Sonia, had a laugh like gravel and a past that smelled of cigarettes and city wind. They gave me names in the chorus of the cell, and their faces taught me how to trust again in little increments.
There is a kind of currency in prison that has nothing to do with money. It is the currency of favors and shared cigarettes, of someone saving you a small square of bread. It is the currency of listening. I collected it and banked it. The first months were a study in containment. I learned to breathe with the steady rise and fall of other people's suffering. When visitors came, when my son came, their faces passed like weather. He stood behind glass that smelled of disinfectant and regret, and I said nothing. I had a reason for that silence that startled people outside who could not understand the arithmetic of betrayal. If I let his voice reach past the barrier, if I let his apology be small and private, I would be handing him back whatever soft corner of himself had been consumed by the accusation. Silence was not only refusal, it was a safeguard for the dignity I still possessed. Let him speak to the clerk. Let him taste the consequences of what he had fed into the world. He left after 5 minutes. He did not pound on the glass. He did not cry in front of the other waiting relatives who pretended not to listen. He folded himself into his coat and walked out like a person who carries a secret in perfect insulation. Every night I wrote. I wrote lists and lines that would have escaped a less disciplined mind. I catalogued phone calls he had made, the way she had laughed in the park, the dates I had hosted him for dinner, the time he had accidentally broken a saucer, and how we had mended it together with glue that left a ghost of the silver pattern. The notebook became a map, not of evidence in the legal sense, but of the life that existed outside the accusation. In the odd hours when the corridors were quiet, I would read entries aloud and hold them as if they were prayers.
A young guard, Diego, was hired that year. He was 22 and moving through the job with the slow bewilderment of someone who believed a story could be simple. He came to my cell with a bundle of paperwork one afternoon and stood in the doorway, hands tucked into the seam of his jacket like a bird tucking wings. "Do you want to see something?" he asked, as if confessing. He had a way of speaking that imagined trust as a bridge, an invitation, not an imposition. He slid a copy of part of a hospital file across my bunk. The paper smelled faintly of printer ink and something older, maybe coffee. I knew enough to keep my face still, to keep my voice at a measured pitch. "This is not part of the file they gave at trial. Someone in records left it misfiled. I shouldn't be showing you." I do not think he expected the reaction he got. Most people in uniforms are bred to obey. The idea that a prisoner would stare without reaching for sensation surprised him. The pages were ordinary enough. A nurse's handwritten notes, a line typed in a way that didn't match the formal report, a small signature in the margin someone had forgotten to initial.
The note said something in a way that twisted the trajectory of the accusation. It mentioned fever, infection, an internal note that the loss might be associated with an untreated infection, not anything a third party could have caused. The phrasing was careful, clinical, and the kind of thing that, if it had been placed correctly before trial, might have opened a different door in the court's imaginations. "How did this end up out of place?" I asked. I held the paper as if I were too heavy for it, as if the weight of a fact could crush me. My hands did not shake. "Records get messy," said Diego. "Someone stamps wrong, someone files a copy. I can't explain it. I only noticed because I was sorting papers." He did not say that he had the look of someone who wanted to make things right. He did not say that he had seen the way the prosecutor's office had marched the case with a certainty that made his chest ache. He only handed me the paper and stood in the doorway like a boy who has been given a dangerous toy. There were rules in those corridors. Keep to your lines, do not trade information, never become the subject of casual sympathy. Diego recited those rules once, as if he were practicing them. Then he offered something that felt like a hinge in my life. "If there was another report, someone might remember. Maybe your case wasn't the only one decided by one file." It is strange what a slip of paper can do to a human heart. I had thought for years of evidence as a dry animal, documents and signatures and the cold light of an examiner's lamp. But the paper he gave me tasted of possibility. It was not exoneration. It was not even a formal claim. It was an opening, a seam. I folded the page into my notebook like a pressed leaf and walked to the sink to rub my hands under the cold water until the paper's imprint blurred in the skin. That night, the ward smelled of boiled cabbage and the quiet high of other people's prayers. I lay down on the thin mattress and allowed myself a private, ridiculous thing, to imagine the creak of a courtroom that might find other notes, other voices, other openings. From then on, the notebook became not just a ledger of memories, but an archive of questions. I read the pages aloud at night to Maria and Sonia, and they listened with the kind of attention that imagines justice as a story with pages. The more I spoke, the more precise my memory became. Names arrived in my mouth as if by habit. The neighbor across the street, Mrs. Duarte, remembered Clara's visits, how she had sometimes been too close to Alfredo for comfort. A woman in the yard remembered seeing them hold hands like children. These were not legal facts. They were impressions, small assertions of how a life had been rearranged. Outside the walls, the town's rhythm rearranged itself to the news. People who once smiled to my face now said hello only with their eyes. A grocery clerk crossed the street.
A woman I had tutored in reading blocked me from her afternoon market. The sense of being invisible reasserted itself in the oddest moments, the way mail arrived less often, the way the bus slowed at my stop and then went on. There were barbs inside as well, other prisoners attempting to make sense of who I had been before the number on my shirt would ask, sometimes with blunt curiosity and sometimes with the tenderness of the truly hard, whether my son had always been cruel. I told them stories, the time he learned to whistle, the time he stayed up all night when a neighbor's child fell ill, the time he came home soaked from rain and I laughed because he looked like a small drowned bird. These stories were not defenses. They were human counters to the neat geometry of guilt. Occasionally, a sympathetic clerk would slide me an envelope of postcards from people who had believed my tale. They were hand-scrawled notes, a recipe for some soup, a line like, "Do not let them take your laughter." I kept these in the back of the notebook as if they were talismans. The presence of other people's faith did something small and steady. It kept me from dissolving entirely. In the 4th year, when familiarity settled into the cell like a second skin, a poet came to the yard. He was a middle-aged man with a beard like a small cloud and a tendency to recite lines in a tone that suggested he had known sorrow as a teacher rather than an accident. He read to us from a book about maps, and I thought of the notebook as a map of the wrong that had been done to me. He finished a stanza and looked directly at me. "You chart where the coast has been broken," he said, as if reading my handwriting. "A map keeps a shape for when the sea claims land." "Does it?" I answered. "Can a map bring back what the tide took?" He shrugged and smiled. "It can show where to begin again." Diego's visits remained infrequent and nervous. He would stand at the cell door, pretend to check records, and sometimes slide a scrap of paper across the slot with a quick movement. Once he left me a note that said simply, "Ask for the clerk, bring a copy of your notebook." It was reckless and kind. "Do not bring trouble on yourself," Maria said when I returned to our bunk, clutching the paper. I had to be careful. A synonym for resilience in prison is patience. I learned to fold my energy into the small things, ironing a crease in the page, making the coffee in a way that reminded me of mornings at the kitchen table, sending a folded note tucked into a seam of a shirt to the woman who smuggled stamps through the laundry. Each small act was a stitch in the long seam that kept me whole. The rumor that the case had been feeding on a single report reached the yard like a scent. People in the outer wards, those who had family or who followed the news, would nod when they saw me and say with the solemnity of those who know injustice, "Paper does half the work."
The rest is for those who have the courage to look. Courage is a complicated commodity in a place where a wrong glance can mean trouble. It is also contagious. A woman whose eyes had been closed with anger for years stood in the yard one afternoon and said in a voice like a rusted hinge, "If there is another report, you must find someone to read it more loudly than a judge." I did not have a lawyer yet. Lawyers in that place appeared like seasonal trees. Some years there were more, some years there flew a few birds with the sense of being kind. I had stories of lawyers who took money and never returned to files. I had faith in neither charm nor gift. What I had was a paper folded into my notebook and a young guard with a puppyish tendency toward honesty. When he confided that he had been assigned to a new rotation in records, I watched his face consult itself like a weather vane. "They archive in a way that can lose things," he told me, as if rehearsing a confession. "But sometimes they misfile something else in the drawer. If someone looks, they might find it." "Who looks?" I asked. He shrugged. In his measurement, someone willing to spend long hours reading stacks of paper was a rarer breed than those who marched with badges.
"There's a clerk," he said, finally. "He hates errors. He drinks a lot of bitter coffee and keeps an eye on things. Name is Jose." The name landed in me like a small pebble dropping into a deep well. It made rings. "There are people," I thought aloud. The sentence finished itself into a plan I had no right to own yet. My son continued to live on the margins of my days, a weather pattern I watched without participation. He sent a single letter in the second year. It sat in its envelope like an apology that would not flower. I opened it at night and read what he had written. A sentence about misunderstanding, a line about the past that sounded like regret, and then a paragraph that ended with the small, final thing people use when they offer absolution that isn't complete. "I am trying to understand." The letter smelled faintly of the cologne he had once favored. I folded it and refolded it until the lines blurred with time. I kept writing, not because I believed the justice system would be kind, but because there is a secret law of memory. To record is to anchor. If you allow the facts to drift, they become a story that someone else can narrate for you. I would not let someone else write my margins. There were days when the weight of the accusation became a physical ache behind the ribs, a pressure that made speech clumsy and laughter rare. I visited the cell's little sink in the middle of the night and leaned against the cold tile and thought of the garden. I remembered the orange tree Alfredo had climbed when he was small and the way his father had taught him not to jump from high branches. I thought about how often we confuse being loved with being understood.
The way people in power bend a narrative's arc toward convenience is a lesson of the bitterest kind. In the 5th year, a young woman visited me in the yard carrying a small bag of oranges. She was not connected to my case. She was simply a volunteer, a woman from a church who had gingerly crossed the line of pity and hope many times before. Her name was Anna. She sat with me on a bench whose paint was worn down to reveal wood like a thumbprint. We spoke of little things, how the sun looked when it found sleep under an awning, how a cracked mug can be mended with invisible glue if you look hard enough. "You have patience," she said. "Most women with your story would have undone themselves years ago." "No," I answered. "Most people I know would have leapt. I had to learn to let the world move around me until something else gave." "Do you want help?" she asked, as if the word were simple. "There are many kinds of help. Some come as money, some as legal files, some as the loud comfort of public voice. I did not yet know which help would be the one to open the seam. I had a notion, the kind of thing that grows from soil you have tended, that paper would be the way. If the case had been shaped by a single report, perhaps another paper could make the town's imagination tilt. That was not a certainty. It was an argument I would have to craft, person by person, page by page. A rumor passed in the 6th year that the prosecutor's office was overworked and that some files had been archived in the wrong drawer when they renovated. It felt like wind in a heavy door. People nodded at me in the yard with the small conspiratorial hope of the desperate, and I began to believe a possibility that had previously been a phantom. Diego came to the cell one rainy afternoon with the look people get when they have been taught patience and practiced a small defiance. He handed me another page. This time it was a handwritten note from a nurse who had been transferred to another hospital. The ink had bled a little at the edge, the kind of thing that proves human hands had touched it. I kept this because I thought it was odd. She wrote, "Infectious symptoms noted," in the margins. No one stamped it into the main report. He waited for me to take it. His eyes were earnest. He did not say he would become my champion. He said nothing more than that. "Do you know anyone who can look at this officially?" I asked. "No," he replied, "but you should keep it somewhere safe."
I folded it into the coin pocket of my robe, where I kept the small tokens I allowed myself, a picture of my son at 7 with missing teeth, a dried petal of a bouquet Alfredo had once brought home, the pressed page from the misfiled report. I felt foolish sometimes gathering relics, and I felt cunning in other moments, as if I were a seamstress gathering threads for a garment I would one day wear to the courthouse.
It was in one of those small, gauzy moments, early afternoon, rain on the metal roof, the yard a pool of gray, that I wrote a line I would keep returning to. I will not be defined by what others choose to believe. I folded the sentence into the notebook and underlined it twice. When the evening bell rang and we marched back to our cells, the metal door sighed shut with that familiar exhale. I pressed my forehead to the cool of the steel and whispered the line like a prayer. It did not make what had happened go away. It did not remove the years, but it made the center of me reform so that I might stand again when the day came to speak with a voice that belonged to no one but myself. Weeks later, a slip of paper appeared at the bottom of the feed slot in my cell. It bore a name and a phone number, and one sentence: "There may be someone who remembers the notes we did not see." I read it twice. The ink looked like the patient handwriting of someone who had practiced kindness in a hand that rarely had reason to be so gentle. That night I lay awake thinking of the clerk named Jose, of Diego's nervous, earnest face, of the nurse who had mumbled the word infection into a margin like a secret. It was all small, yes, but small things start revolutions if you are patient enough to assemble them. I turned to the notebook and wrote in a steady, deliberate hand, "Gather the papers, gather the voices. Do not let the story sleep in someone else's drawer again." Then I slept, and in my sleep imagined a corridor lined with files, opening like doors. One by one they revealed the shape of a different truth. In the morning I woke with something like the old habit of hope in my chest. It was not a bright hope. It was a slow, patient thing, a plan. I folded the new slip of paper and slipped it into the pocket where I kept the misfiled notes like a talisman. I would keep being patient. I would keep stitching. The world outside might not notice, but a seam is a seam because it holds. The day Diego whispered, "They found another copy," I felt the floor shift. He had a look of careful joy, the sort one reserves for a small child who has finally learned to stand. His voice was low, as if not to disturb the southward slide of time. "Someone in archives remembered. They pulled a duplicate. You should see it." My fingers closed around the note until the edges blurred. The prison tasted like oxidized metal and the sweet tang of boiled oranges from the yard. For the first time in years, the idea of walking through a door that did not close behind me felt plausible. Not certain, plausible. It is a dangerous thing to let hope rise too quickly. I folded it down and tucked it into the small pocket in my chest where old memories sit, the soft place that remembers songs. I did not tell Maria and Sonia right away. I wanted to be clear in my own mind what a duplicate could mean. A duplicate was not innocence. It was a fact. Facts, when improperly tended, have different lives. They need people to put them in order. That evening she came to my cell, Clara. She had not visited the yard. She had not come to any bench, any door, any place where I might speak with the public. She walked in wearing a coat that hugged her shoulders like the rest of the world had been tailored to greet her. She moved with the ease of someone who owned the right to a place in the sun. She smiled in a way that had been taught, I thought, to persuade. Her voice was a practiced softness. "I heard," she said, "I heard there have been discoveries." Her eyes flicked to the notebook. She did not need to ask if I had seen paper.
People like her never ask questions, they make assertions. You are welcome to look at it, I said, but do not expect me to be grateful. She laughed, a sound I had once mistaken for warmth, and later recognized as a thin instrument shaped to its use. Mae, she said then, turning the word like a toy, you know what I have lost, you know what happened. She said it not as accusation now, but as a plea for the world to keep her story's center. The miscarriage, her loss, was a wound everyone recognized in small-town language, and she carried that wound in a way that made people look for someone to blame. I kept my face still. There are ways of speaking that do not give people the satisfaction of a reaction. I did not rise to it. I did not allow the room to fill with the sound of a mother's defense. I had learned to make the small grammar of silence into armor. Whatever the paper says, I said, we will let the facts be patients. They must speak for themselves. She looked at me then with the sudden, naked thing that people call vulnerability. It was theater, perhaps, or perhaps the strain of having built a story that needed to be constant. I did not pity her. Pity is an indulgence that women in my life could not afford. When she left, the corridor felt thinner, as if a person had extracted a breath. I went to the sink and washed my hands until the water ran clear. In the mirror, someone older looked back, hair like winter, eyes like a ledger. I smiled at myself, not the triumphant smile that leaves a person changed, but the steady one that says, I am here. The duplicate, if it existed, could not erase the years I had been alive in that cell. It could, if treated with care, begin to unravel a small, stubborn knot in the tapestry of my life. That night I wrote again in the notebook, in letters that felt like prayer. If paper is a weapon, I thought, it is a weapon that requires patience to wield. And then, in the small hours, the sound of paper sliding under the slot came like the beginning of a prayer. I opened the envelope with the slow hands of someone who had learned not to be hasty in joy. The photocopy inside bore a stamp that read, Archives, Duplicate.
There were lines in the margin that echoed what Diego had said. Infectious symptoms, neglected treatment, notes that never made it to the final report. I held the copy like a lantern. I held it and let its light fill the dark corners of 8 years. I did not feel relief so much as a surge of work. This was not a finish, it was a hinge. When dawn finally pried itself through the slotted window, I sat on the edge of the thin mattress with the photocopy pressed to my knees and felt the strange, sharp feeling of possibility. The cell around me still hummed with the ordinary complaint of the building, pipes clicking, a distant radio, someone crying softly into a pillow. I breathed and let the rhythm steady me. There is a moment in any reclamation when the person who has been wronged realizes the shape of what must be done. It is not a single flash, it is a slow assembling. Gather the papers, find the voices, let the truth be heard loud enough to make the town's own ears ache. Diego's note said there might be people who remember. Jose the clerk likes coffee that is too bitter, and he hates a sloppy file. A brother, someone whispered in the yard once, had spoken to a neighbor and admitted that his memory had been colored. He had not known everything his sister was saying. These were not certainties, they were leads, they were threads. I folded the photocopy into the notebook, closed the book with a hand that no longer trembled, and stood. The metal under my feet did not feel like a floor to be bowed to. It felt like a platform. I did not know yet how the town would receive the idea that a line in the margin could have the power to move a case, but I knew I could wait and gather
and call names. When the young guard returned that evening and slid a folded page through the slot, he met my eyes directly for the first time, without the nervousness he usually wore like a scarf. They started a search, slow, but it started. The words were simple. The prison smelled of rain and boiling oranges. I pressed my palm to the photocopy and felt the ridges of the stamp under my fingers. For 8 years I had kept the shape of the house inside my chest like a hard private knoll. Now, for the first time, it felt like the hill might be climbed. I did not know the shape of what would come next, only how to gather paper and names and the slim, dangerous thing called patience. I walked to the sink and washed my hands again, not to clean away the years, but to steady them, to steady myself for the work ahead. The door clicked closed behind me, like the final sentence of a long paragraph, but the silence was not the old silence of surrender. It was a waiting room, and I was prepared to stand and speak when they finally called my name. Diego's voice had the softness of someone trying not to wake a roomful of sleeping things. They started a search, he told me, and the sentence landed like something that could be built upon.
It was not a victory yet. It was the beginning of work. A duplicate could be a crack in a story made of convenient certainties. It could make people look twice. For the first time in years, the shape of possibility had an edge. The days after that were measured not by hope, but by action. Diego's visits became the thin, steady drumbeat of information. Someone in archives had indeed pulled a stack of files. Jose, the clerk who hated sloppy work and drank bitter coffee at breakfast, had been patient enough to notice a second copy stamped quietly in the wrong folder. Jose was a man whose face told you he had misplaced the habit of smiling. His mouth was a tired canyon lined with experience. He came to the visitation room with a paper bag and the kind of timber that made me feel he had been carrying the news like contraband. "You must understand," he said, when Rosa met him for the first time, a woman with hair cut like a statement and a way of folding papers as if she could smooth the past flat. "I see things other people hurry past. I kept a copy. I don't think it was malicious, just messy, but it was important." Rosa, my lawyer, moved around paperwork in a way that suggested maps and plans. She had been recommended by a woman who worked at the community center and who had said simply, "Rosa doesn't rush. She listens twice as much as she speaks." When I first met her in the visiting area, she reached across the barrier, and instead of offering platitudes, she put her hand flat against the cool glass, as if to anchor us both in the reality of the moment. "You kept a copy?" she asked Jose, not because she doubted him, but to let the plain fact be named aloud. Jose pushed the thin envelope toward the glass slot, as if it were a fragile seed. It had that line in the margin, infection noted, nurse's handwriting in the side. Whoever made the official report didn't carry that phrase forward. I thought it might matter, so I saved it. We read the duplicate together in the small privacy of that visiting room. Rosa hummed as she scanned, clinical notes in shorthand, the phrase febrile episode, signs consistent with infection, scrawled in a different ink, a nurse's timid signature half buried at the bottom. There were dates that overlapped and a loose index number that matched the file brought to trial, but not the final binder. She did not raise her voice. She simply sat, the way a shipkeeper might study a damaged hull to find where to start repairs. "This is a thread," she said, and the word had the steadiness of someone who knew how to turn a raw thing into a case. Not proof of innocence, but it's new. It's enough to request review. We will ask for an official verification from the hospital records, and I will file a petition for re-examination. It will take paperwork, contacts, and patience. Patience had been my teacher for years. Now it would be our tool. He came to the prosecutor's office with Rosa, and quietly, with his own confession. He told the investigator in a voice that drifted like a fabric thread. He said this not in my presence at first, but later with me in the visiting area. He explained that he had been shielded from details, that the household had contained its own stories of loss and of what to say in public. She was fragile, he said of his sister. When she needed someone, we told a story that made sense to everyone. I see now the gaps. Witnesses are complicated things. They're both human and instruments. Paolo's statement was not an indictment written by me. It was a human offering, small and honest, a line in the margin that shifted the picture. He signed an affidavit acknowledging that he had heard details that contradicted the version told at trial, and that he had not spoken up then because loyalty, family loyalty, had seemed more urgent than truth. Rosa sat beside me as Paolo laid out what he remembered, the timeline of Clara's visits to the hospital, the way symptoms had been described to family members as sudden and unexplained, and moments when medical staff had murmured about infection without that note ever finding its way into the final file. He did not say that someone had plotted to use me as a scapegoat. He said, with the kind of shame that belongs to people who have been complicit in silence, that the family had chosen a story that spared them the complexity of the truth. Complexity is expensive in small towns. People prefer neat angles and clean narratives. To admit an oversight is to invite messy humanity. Paolo's testimony added another thread to the messy knot and made the case less comfortable for those invested in the old story. When the prosecutor called Rosa to say that the case would be formally re-examined, the words felt thin and legal, investigation reopened, further inquiries scheduled. But the voice on the phone had an undercurrent that shivered with consequence. They would interview medical staff, subpoena records, and take witness statements that might, if the facts pointed that way, change the trajectory of the file. They would not promise absolution, they promised to look. That was what I asked for, a place where facts could be placed next to one another and judged. The prison allowed me a very brief leave under supervision during the period the review was initiated. They released me under specific terms. I would remain available for questioning and could not leave the jurisdiction without permission. It was not a full clearing, but it was a step that flattened the distance between me and the world I had once known. The air, when I walked out of the prison gate, had the extraordinary brightness of a photograph developed in haste. The color of the sky felt sharper, as if years had lain between me and the sun, and now the sun was confrontationally close.
People on the street glanced at me with that curious look of those who have watched something unfold in print. Some eyes were sympathetic. Others held a cautious geometry of social distance, a private ledger of what they believed. Outside, Rosa stood by a small, battered car and opened the door for me as if that were an ordinary kindness. "Walk slow," she instructed, not as a reprimand, but as a plan. "You will be allowed visits from family, but think carefully about how you start those conversations. We are in the press cycle now. People will want statements." I had prepared for the gates to be soft with forgiveness, for my son to be there on the other side of the security barrier, like a repentant figure. I had imagined the possibility of his arms and the ache of reconciliation. Instead, he waited across a public bench, his face set in stone I recognized, but had not seen in motion. When he stood and walked toward me, his steps were the cautious ones of someone approaching a fault line. "Mom," he said, and there was a rawness in the one syllable, a word polished by guilt. For a long time I did not answer.
I felt the old temptation to collapse the years into a single moment and to demand a correction as if time could be returned. But I had learned small instruments of restraint, rage soothed into clarity. I found the line I wanted and spoke it. "You chose a story over me," I said, quietly. "You believed it and you repeated it. I am not your enemy, Alfredo. I am the one you left." He flinched at that, an animal surprised by the sharpness of a truth it had not expected. "I thought I was protecting you," he murmured, which was both apology and confession. "I thought if I agreed with what people said, it would shut the noise." "Protection," I replied, "is not the same as silence. You are not a child anymore. You cannot hide behind what feels tidy." He wept then, a wet small sound that he had never allowed himself in front of me. I did not fold him into my chest. That would have undone the lesson both of us needed. I let him stand with his shame, and that severed the immediate possibility of ease. His repentance was private, mine was not. I had been given a path to public reclamation, and I would not confuse the two. Confrontations followed in waves. People I had known for decades came with different faces. A woman I had once tutored in reading brought a bag of bread and said she had kept secrets too long. A neighbor who once crossed the street avoided my eye entirely. The press arrived in small civilized waves, microphones poised like curious birds. Rosa navigated interviews with the kind of economy that keeps facts central and avoids the poetry of despair. She would later say that we had been gifted a rare thing, a file that could plausibly alter the memory the town had chosen to keep. Clara's presence, when she appeared in public at all, was measured like the choreography of someone who knows the camera's appetite.
She maintained the posture of a woman carrying absence. At a meeting in the hospital parking lot, when I happened upon her by accident, she greeted me with an armor that had the sheen of someone who had practiced being wronged. "You look different," she said, with a softness that can be read as either compassion or a practiced plea. "You look as you always did," I answered, tired in a way that wants more applause than the facts deserve. She laughed, thin and brittle. "People will always want to tell a story," she said. "Some stories are kinder." There are many ways to confront someone you believe has used you as a scapegoat. You can shout, you can plead, you can collapse into the need to be seen. I chose another route. I kept the conversation small and surgical. "Do you remember the nurse's note?" I asked, because I knew that if the paper was the hinge, then the details mattered. She avoided my eyes. For a moment I saw the complicated thing beneath the act, fear, the weight of having made choices that could unravel, the private cost of sustaining a public narrative. "We all remember differently," she said. "Pain rearranges memory. Memory is not the only thing that rearranges. Paper does that too." What came next was less theatrical than I had imagined. Rosa filed the petition for reopening with the prosecutor's office, and the clerk's stamp read as if it were a new section of history. "Review initiated. File reopened." There was a small bureaucratic satisfaction in that red ink. It felt like a visible notch where years might be remeasured. The prosecutor assigned an investigator who had the patient slowness of someone who liked following paper trails. She read the duplicate with the same dispassionate interest a jeweler gives a stone, and then she asked to speak to nurses, to clerks, to anyone who might have touched the file. The hospital complied, and its administrators produced interviews and records that, piece by deliberate piece, made it harder to sustain the neat narrative that had sent me away. A nurse, who was now working in a different department, remembered a gap in the process and had the courage to say so under oath.
A technician confirmed that notes sometimes traveled separately, that margin handwriting could belong to a shift colleague who expected the main report would incorporate it. No one said the old story had been fabricated in malice. They said something more mundane and more human. Systems falter, people assume, stories congeal around convenience. Paulo's testimony added an emotional layer. He signed a statement that said in part, "I did not understand then how much detail was missing. We were grieving, and we told the story that made the most sense in the moment. I regret that we did not ask more questions." His courage unsettled local sympathies. If a brother could admit oversight, the neatness of the old version unraveled in the town's shops and cafeterias like thread.
The weeks of inquiries were alternately exhausting and clarifying. The prosecutor's office requested depositions, and Rosa prepared me for questions with gentle rehearsal. She advised me not to shout at hearings, to keep my answers short, to allow the truth to be a steady drumbeat rather than a scream. I practiced with the notebook open on the kitchen table, my kitchen now quiet and strange, with my hand running over the pressed papers like a person feeling for bone under skin. There was an undercurrent of public interest that felt like a crowd at a funeral, respectful at a distance, curious at the edges. Sometimes journalists called with questions they meant politely. Sometimes neighbors offered support that felt fragile. I tried to accept kindness without mistaking it for absolution. The goal was not to be adored. The goal was to have the facts laid before the right eyes. The son, Alfredo, found himself attacked not only by his conscience, but by the storied reality of his own choices. The evidence made him revisit moments he had taken for granted, the times he had left the house smelling of another presence, the times his contempt for complicated explanations had shut down conversations. One evening in the kitchen, where the light made familiar, forgiving patterns, he sat across from me and put his head in his hands. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he said, voice broken by the weight of trying to be small. "I thought I needed to protect people. I didn't think what I was doing had consequences for you." "You protected what was comfortable for you. You did not protect me. You lent your voice to a sentence that made my life a crime." He looked at me then with a transparency that was almost unbearable. "I was afraid," he confessed. "I was afraid of losing Clara, of being alone. I thought if I chose the simpler story, I would keep my life from fracturing. I see now that I fractured someone else." That recognition, when it arrived, was a painful beauty. He wanted to apologize in every small way, to fold himself into acts of restitution that would scrub away years. I told him gently that restitution is not a single act, it is a lifetime's work. It is proving that you will not choose convenience over truth when the stakes are a mother's life. He understood the magnitude of what he had done and also the smallness of the reparations he could offer immediately. He offered money for legal fees. He offered his testimony. He offered to assist as a witness in reopening inquiries. Rosa advised caution. The legal process must be navigated carefully. His offer to help was accepted as part of the messy truth. Clara's public presence cracked more visibly when a local reporter asked a question she had not anticipated at a neighborhood meeting. A man in the front row raised his hand and asked bluntly whether she had been completely transparent about the symptoms she had experienced, and whether her account at trial had included all that was known at the time. Cameras were not there in that moment, but the question traveled like a small stone dropped in familiar water. Her face crumpled in a way that suggested she had been holding something taut for a long time. She began, and the rest came out in a small, shaking stream. She said she had been afraid. She said she had believed what someone close to her had urged her to say because it made sense in grief. She admitted, in a voice that separated from the public performance and leaned into the private human, that details had been omitted. Her words were not a tidy confession, they were raw and messy, the kind of human thing that invites both condemnation and pity. When the investigator read Paolo's affidavit and the nurse's testimony into the formal file, and when the hospital produced the stamped duplicate, the case took a different shape on paper. The prosecutor's office issued a statement that was precise and careful. Quote, "Upon preliminary review, new material evidence has been identified. The case will be re-examined by the prosecution. No determination of guilt or innocence is made at this stage." Unquote. That statement was less than vindication and more than silence. It is the place a rightful process should live, methodical, patient, and neither theatrical nor cruel. The morning the police returned to the house to take formal statements was ceremonial in the small town way. Neighbors gathered at a discreet distance and watched as our past, the house with its cracked mug and orange tree, became a place of inquiry again. The son answered questions. Paolo gave a fuller testimony than he had at first. Clara, fragile and apologetic, gave hers. The public watched with the faint tremor one reserves for those who observe a family being measured by a machine of law. At the end of that day, the investigator told Rosa in private that they had found enough inconsistency and new evidence to present to a judge and ask for a formal re-examination of the original conviction. The phrase formal re-examination felt heavier than the earlier preliminary review. The files were being moved down a different corridor. They would be opened to a port again. I will not pretend the papers, the duplicated pages, the nurse's note, the affidavits, magically restored the years I had lost. They did something different and more fragile. They invited the law to do what the law should do: look again, correct mistakes, listen to voices that had been absent. There is a strange mercy in a system that can acknowledge error. It is a mercy jigsawed with slow steps and bureaucratic rhythms. When the judge signed an order allowing for re-examination, he wrote it in a stamp that today felt like the seal on a long-lost envelope.
The court's language was careful. Case reopened for new evidence. This did not automatically mean the conviction would be overturned. It meant a process had been restored to a more honest shape. It meant I would finally have an audience that could listen to the full melody of the facts, not only the clearest notes that had been easy to hear. News outlets ran quiet, dignified pieces, no shouting banners, as Rosa insisted. Some articles softened, others remained skeptical. The town shifted again. A woman who used to avoid my eyes now came with a loaf of bread, and the words, "I'm sorry," pressed into its crust like a prayer. The world did what it always does. It rearranged itself around new facts. Release from the prison had been a partial liberty. The full day I walked free with the state's permission felt like a reclamation ritual. I wore my own coat, the one with the patched elbow, and walked slowly through streets that had seemed foreign. People stopped me and touched my hand in small ways. The contact was both healing and complicated. I visited the park bench that had become a motif in my mind, where the orange tree cast shade, where a cracked mug could be imagined mended. I sat and breathed as if practicing for a life that was reacquainted with the world. Not all reconciliations were sweet. Some relationships had been broken beyond immediate mending. The son and I spent months learning how to be in the same room without rushing to the old cadence of domestic ease. He did chores I asked, small necessary things that showed a will to repair habits of neglect.
He attended court hearings, sat in the back with Rosa and took notes, like a man preparing to own his choices. That was not the same as forgiveness. It was a start. Publicly, Clara's life shifted in a quieter way. She retreated at first, the glare having become unbearable, and later returned to town with a humility that was not performative. She visited the hospital to apologize to staff. She sent letters expressing confusion and regret. The community responded with an assortment of human reactions. Some forgave, others kept silence. The emotional truth is that when a narrative fractures, everyone who borrowed that narrative must reinvent themselves in its aftermath. Legal hearings unfolded with a patient cruelty. Depositions, cross-examinations, the slow unspooling of what was known and not known. The prosecutor's office, now with corrections in the file, recommended a formal review of the conviction. The judge weighed evidence with the slow gravity of someone balancing a scale. And then, after a long day of listening, after testimony from a nurse, from Paulo, from Jose, and from myself, the court issued an order that changed my legal status in a concrete way. The conviction would be subjected to a full evidentiary hearing with the possibility of appeal to correct the record.
That day, as the clerk stamped the motion and the words "full evidentiary hearing granted" made the rounds, a small bell of relief sounded in my chest. It was not exoneration. It was the legal world doing its job. That job had delayed me for 8 years, but now it was at least moving in the direction of correction. I returned to the house and found the cracked mug where I had left it. The orange tree had grown taller than it had when I went away. Perhaps the tree had been patient while I was not. I took the mug, scrubbed it, and set it on the windowsill like a talisman. The simple domestic acts of washing dishes and making tea became acts of reclamation. I wrote new entries in the notebook, ones that documented small pleasures because joy needed corroboration now that my life had been interrupted by a long absence. There were still dark pockets, people who spoke in thinly veiled tones, a bus driver who refused to let me pass at first. The world is not all mercy. It is a mosaic with many tesserae. But there was movement. There were consequences for Clara as well. When a reporter pressed her for a public statement about the margin notes and the missing information, she visibly crumpled. Her voice trembled as she admitted that in grief she had relied on the version of events others presented to her. She did not offer a grand confession. She offered halting human truth. There was no dramatic fall of grace in the way tabloids sometimes fantasize. There was, instead, the slow unpeeling of a person who had been both victim and actor. At one small community hearing, where townspeople gathered to listen to the port's reading of the order, Clara arrived, and in a voice that was no longer shielded, she read a statement. It began with apology and moved toward an account of confusion and fear. She said she had been in pain and had sometimes let narrative override reflection. The words were more of a plea than a demand for forgiveness. People reacted with the complexity befitting human beings. Some embraced her attempt at honesty, others recoiled, uncertain how to reconcile the woman who had claimed pain with the woman whose account had contributed to my conviction. Alfredo came to every hearing. He sat in the back row and read transcripts like a man searching for the sum of what he had done. He offered statements when Rosa advised him that his testimony might be necessary. At one point, during an extended session where witnesses were deposing events again with the surgical attention of a second look, he stood and addressed the court. "I testified the way I thought best at the time," he said, voice thin. "I was wrong. I believed the simplest explanation and I did not ask enough questions. I am responsible for letting that happen." There was no showy theatricality in his statement, only a man attempting to accept the weight of what he had done. In that moment, I felt the small, odd relief of someone who had at last been heard.
The law was listening,
and he was speaking with accountability. The town began to shift its practices subtly. A neighbor who once refused my eye began to bring over soup. A grocer who had barred me from their delivery service called to apologize and to ask if I needed help. These small acts did not undo the past, but they stitched tiny seams into the fabric of an ordinary life. The legal process continued. Depositions, hearings, and a slow procession of official paper moved across desks like a ritual dance. The prosecutor assembled a binder that contained the duplicate report, the nurse's statements, Paulo's affidavit, José's notes, and the critique of the original file's omissions. There was no triumphalism in the office, only the sober work of correction. The judge ordered that the evidentiary hearing should be public, and people came to watch as if attending a play about their own moral choices. The hearing itself was long and precise. Witnesses spoke under oath. Doctors explained how a margin notation about infection could shift the plausible causes of a pregnancy loss. The technician described how files had once been misfiled during the hospital's rushed renovation. Paulo described with humility the simple human failure to ask uncomfortable questions. The court was a place where facts were clarified, where human fragility collided with institutional error. At the end, the judge did not stand with a clarion of reform. He issued an order that read tight and narrow, a review of the conviction on the grounds of newly presented medical documentation and witness testimony. It was not a declaration of innocence. It was an invitation to fix mistakes. When the day came that my name was once again read into a courtroom as a person under review rather than as a convicted criminal, I felt the swell of the years in my chest. I thought of the mattress in the cell and the thin blanket with its chemical smell. I thought of the small notebooks where I had recorded the orange tree afternoons and the time Alfredo had stolen my watch. I thought of how many ordinary things had been lost to the shape of a single report, and of how paper can both destroy and save. The judge listened to arguments from both sides. The defense argued for a full examination of how the original file came to include the narrative that led to my conviction. They asked for the conviction to be vacated pending a review. The prosecution, having reviewed the new material, recommended that the conviction be re-evaluated in light of the evidence and that the court consider whether earlier findings had been reached on incomplete facts. The words were careful. The outcome remained in judicial hands. When the judge finally ruled that the conviction would be set aside pending a full retrial, or, put another way, that the legal system would not stand by an outcome potentially shaped by incomplete evidence, it was both a release and not.
The phrasing was technical. Conviction set aside pending retrial or review. My name was no longer an absolute. This was not a redemption story made easy, but it was a restoration of the possibility of a fair hearing. The day I walked out of the courthouse after the hearing, the weight on my shoulders felt different. I had not been declared innocent in the moral sense that heals all wounds. I had been given the chance to have a story told with fuller facts. That possibility itself was a kind of mercy. After years of being watched in suspicion, I saw some of the town's faces bloom with apology. People spoke to me with a newfound tenderness and a want to repair. A woman from the market brought a bag of seed packets and said, "Plant whatever you like. Let it grow with what is left." Those small moments were not balm that erased the years. They were invitations to create a life that could incorporate both loss and the labor of healing. I returned to the notebook often. At night I read aloud passages to myself I had written in the stale years, and to the new pages I began to fill.
Observations about the coffee I now learned to like again, small poems tucked between facts, lists of the people I wanted to thank for their courage. The notebook that had once been a ledger of survival became also a journal of new tasks, appointments with doctors, meetings with Rosa, visits to the prison to advocate for Maria and Sonia when I could, letters to people who had helped. It remained my map. There were still hard conversations. The son and I set boundaries that would not let history repeat itself in the easy ways of old. He would not be allowed to decide alone the shape of family stories. He learned to sit with discomfort rather than hide from it. He visited me often, and sometimes came with a friend whose presence made him accountable. We were not healed overnight. The healing was a small, patient architecture. Clara, to her credit and to mine, started to attend counseling. Whether it was because of public pressure or private reckoning, she showed up at sessions with a smallness that suggested she wanted to become more complex than the story that had carried her before. It was not my place to investigate her motives or to pronounce absolution. The fact that she risked breaking her performance and stepping into humility mattered more than the theater of retribution. The community itself changed in quieter measures. The local women's group that once met in the old parish hall arranged a small series of conversations on how stories hurt and how the town could better listen to women in moments of crisis. They invited me to speak, and I stood in front of a circle of teaspoons and earnest faces and read a short passage from my notebook. When the world chooses a simple story over messy truth, someone will be forced to hold the weight of certainty. That person can be a mother, a neighbor, or a stranger. We must learn to ask, not to assume.
I did not, in that talk, demand all eyes be turned upon the wrongdoer. I asked for something smaller and more radical, a willingness to be patient and to allow processes to be thorough. Legal matters continued in the background, like a machine that both heals and wears. There were motions filed, procedural delays, questions about admissibility of evidence. Rosa argued with the kind of quiet force that does not need to scream to be heard. She worked with the prosecutor to ensure that the evidentiary record was as complete as possible. We cooperated fully, because my aim had always been to let the true shape of what had happened be visible. There was a small public moment that I will always remember. The clerk placed a stamped sheet on a table that read simply, "Records corrected, duplicate included." The stamp did not dissolve years, but it gave them a new place to stand when they measured the past. People read the notice, and their faces shifted. A neighbor who had been hesitant to look at me directly came and said, "I am sorry. I did not think enough." The acknowledgment was small, but real. As time moved forward, the case retained its legal complexity. A retrial was scheduled. The town watched with the intimacy of those who have a stake in the moral weather. Some people said the legal process was slow. Some said it was necessary. I said neither of those things loudly. I accepted the pace and allowed the judicial work its due course. There were quieter victories alongside the legal ones. I took a walk one afternoon to the park bench where the orange tree spread shade. I sat and listened to the city sounds, the distant hum of a bus, a child's giggle, the scrape of someone sweeping a stoop. I drank tea from the patched mug, and for a small, luminous moment it felt as if time had been put into a new order. The years I had lost were not undone, but they were now a part of the story, not the conclusion. I resumed letters with people who had stayed. Maria wrote to me from inside the prison. She had been transferred for a time, but we kept the habit of words. Her letters were an echo of the yard,
and a reminder of the bonds that hold in the hard places. Sonia, whose laugh had been like gravel, wrote a short note asking if I could bring a small comfort during a later visit. I promised. There were many people still inside the institution who had become the map by which I had learned survival. Their stories mattered, separate from mine. There is a kind of loneliness at the center of an unjust conviction that cannot be fully spoken about. It is not the absence of company, it is the absence of a life as it might have been. The orange tree had grown. The kitchen table bore a new pattern of sunlight. I planted lavender by the yard, cutting a small swath where the soil would take, and the scent would remind me of the spring I had once kept. I took small jobs in the neighborhood, mending clothes, teaching a Thursday class on mending for those with little time, and found that the simple act of repair was a way to teach myself how to be useful in a world that had once used me as a scapegoat. Months later, when the retrial loomed, we prepared with the measured intensity of people trying to be precise. Rosa rehearsed cross-examinations. She coached me through telling my story without letting grief become a spectacle. She instructed me to let the courtroom be the place where facts were allowed to stand naked and be judged. On the day of the hearing, I carried my notebook like a talisman and set it on the table. It contained the photocopy of the duplicate, the letters from Jose and Diego, Paolo's affidavit, and my own handwriting, pages that chronicled a life interrupted and the patient assembly of truth. The court listened. The judge read evidence with the solemnity of someone who knows the limits of words. And in the end, with the judge's opinion shaped by a fuller record, the legal determination changed the arc of my life in a tangible way. The conviction was vacated on the grounds that the original verdict had been reached without access to pivotal medical notes that later surfaced and undermined the chain of causation relied on in the first trial. Language matters. The written order said, "Conviction vacated due to material new evidence." There were procedural conditions attached, no immediate declaration of innocence pending any further proceedings, but the words were as close to legal restoration as I had dared to hope for. The relief was not cinematic, it was pure and methodical and quietly beautiful. Rosa folded down the corner of one of my pages and said, "You will have time to breathe." I did not collapse into ecstasy. I breathed. When I walked out of the courthouse that day, the sun had the clear, bright tone of late summer. I felt old in the bones and young in the pulse that had been returned to me. People lined the sidewalk in small clusters, and some clapped, not in triumph, but in recognition of a wrong at least partially corrected. My son took my hand in the street. He was raw and a little ashamed and wholly human. We did not replace the lost years with easy conversation. Instead, we began the slow work of being present to one another. The town's rumor mill slowed. Some who had been quick to judge sought me out to apologize. Some never returned. I accepted some apologies and ignored others. Forgiveness is not a currency to be exchanged lightly. My dignity, rent and then repaired, was not something bought by a public gesture. It was built by the patient reconstruction of a life, by letters, by neighbors, by the way the lavender grew back in neat rows at the house. The people who had been my companions during incarceration remained in my thoughts.
When circumstances allowed, I organized a small fundraiser with Rosa's guidance and with the help of neighbors who had seen fit to give back. The money paid for small comforts and legal assistance for those who could not afford it. The gesture was practical and not grand.
It was an attempt to relieve the small burdens that many carry in silence. I visited Maria and Sonia as often as the rules allowed, and I brought them bread and the news that at least one wrong was being corrected. Their faces lit up with a kind of eloquent simplicity that made me understand why resilience is not a trait but a daily choice. In private, I wrote in the notebook a new sentence. I walked out of iron and into the slow work of being more than the story they wrote for me. I underlined it twice and let the ink dry like a small promise. Years do not vanish. They leave their marks like rings in a tree. I planted another sapling near the orange tree, and when the wind came through the yard, I thought about how many seasons a person can live through. The world had not been kind to me. It had also not been irreparably cruel. There is a finality to the kind of freedom I tasted that is not the same as innocence. The court's decision had corrected a grave error in my life, but it did not erase the hunger of years stolen. I learned to live with that ambivalence. I accepted help where offered, and offered help where it was needed. I kept writing in the notebook because it stitched memory to the present, page by patient page. One evening, as dusk softened the edges of the town, Alfredo and I walked to the bench where the orange tree spread shade. We did not speak at first. The light fell in long strips. I looked at him, not as the boy who had once climbed into the branches, but as a man who had learned something through a painful education. "Will you stay?" he asked, looking like someone who had not yet found his place in the new map we were drawing. "I will, if you are willing to be honest," I said. "To be present is to be honest even when the truth is hard." He nodded. We sat silently, and then he took a pen from his pocket and wrote on my notebook a short sentence. I was wrong. He folded the paper and placed it in my hand like someone returning a small object of guilt. The notebook holds many things now. Memories, medical notes, a record of bureaucratic corrections, and the thick marks of a life that has been both wounded and repaired. It is a map that will continue to grow. The legal process is, strictly speaking, still in motion. Papers have been filed for review. Some questions remain, and the court will continue to work through procedures. I have learned to let the law be its methodical self, and to keep my life to the work of being human. I do not spend my days shouting the victory.
I spend them noticing small mercies, the way sunlight falls through the window onto the cracked mug, the way the lavender releases its scent when I brush it with my hand, the way neighbors bring small gifts without expectation. I volunteer at the community center sometimes, teaching mending and the art of careful listening. I read to a group of young women who are learning to ask questions before they assume answers. In these small acts, I feel the shape of a life that is no longer an accident of accusation, but a deliberate practice of dignity. If you have stayed with this story, thank you for listening to a life that was interrupted but is being remembered. This is not a tale of triumph over evil. It is the careful narrative of a woman who refused to be written down as something she had not become. The papers, those small, indifferent objects, were the tools that helped unmake the false story. The people, Diego, Jose, Paulo, Rosa, Maria, Sonia, Alfredo, the nurse with the handwriting in the margin, were the ones who made it possible. There is still work to be done, for the town, for the system, for me. Justice is patient and imperfect and necessary.
I will continue to write and to stitch and to speak the truth as clearly as I can. The day I finally walked out of that gate was a liberation of body and an unfastening of silence. I am older now, softer in some ways and firmer in others. The years they stole from me will not be returned in full, but the truth has weight, and in that weight I have found a kind of freedom. If this story moved you, please share it, so others who have been silenced might find someone to read their pages, someone to hold their duplicate report when the world has misplaced the truth. And if you would like to hear more stories of resilience and justice, subscribe. Let these voices be heard.